The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as Thomas Mitchell pushed his cleaning cart through the ancient corridors. At 23, he had been a royal guard for just 18 months, and the routine of maintaining the barracks had become second nature to him. The polished floors reflected his careful movements as he methodically worked his way through each room, ensuring every surface gleamed to perfection. Thomas took pride in his work, even the mundane tasks that came with palace duty. His grandfather had served in the same regiment 40 years earlier, and the family tradition of service ran deep in his blood. The young guard understood that every detail mattered in this historic place where centuries of British history lived within these walls. As he entered the eastern wing of the barracks, Thomas noticed something different in the air. There was an unusual tension, a subtle change in the atmosphere that made his trained senses alert. The corridors seemed quieter than usual, and he could hear muffled voices coming from the briefing rooms down the hall. Through the tall windows, he caught glimpses of unfamiliar vehicles parked in the courtyard, their dark silhouettes standing out against the familiar landscape. The cleaning continued methodically, but Thomas found his attention divided between his duties and the growing sense that something significant was happening. He had learned to read the rhythms of castle life, and today felt markedly different from the routine he had come to know so well. When he reached the main assembly area, Thomas paused to clean the ceremonial weapons display. The polished brass and gleaming steel had always fascinated him, each piece representing decades or even centuries of military tradition. As he carefully wiped down each surface, he reflected on the weight of history that surrounded him daily. These weren't just decorative pieces. They were symbols of the dedication and sacrifice that defined military service. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the stone corridor, growing steadily louder. Thomas continued his work, expecting to see one of his fellow guards or perhaps a palace administrator making their rounds. The footsteps had a different cadence, though, more purposeful and measured than the usual traffic in this part of the building. As the footsteps grew closer, Thomas could hear the distinctive sound of military boots on stone, but there was something different about the rhythm. These weren't the measured steps of ceremonial guards, but the confident stride of someone accustomed to action and command. The sound carried an authority that made him instinctively straighten his posture. The cleaning cloth in his hands moved automatically across the polished surface of an antique rifle as his ears tracked the approaching figure. Years of military training had taught him to maintain focus on his assigned tasks while remaining aware of his surroundings, a skill that served him well in the unique environment of royal service. Through his peripheral vision, Thomas caught sight of a figure turning the corner into his section of the corridor. The newcomer wore a uniform he didn't immediately recognize, though it was clearly military. There was something about the way this person moved that suggested extensive field experience, a confidence that came from facing real challenges rather than ceremonial duties. The stranger's presence filled the space with an energy that Thomas had never encountered during his time at the castle. This wasn't another palace guard or administrator, but someone whose very bearing suggested they had seen action in places far from these peaceful halls. The contrast between the ancient stone walls and this visitor's modern military presence created an almost electric atmosphere. Thomas maintained his cleaning routine, but every fiber of his being was now alert to what might happen next. In his months of service, he had grown accustomed to the predictable rhythms of palace life, but this moment felt like the calm before a storm that could change everything he thought he knew about his role here. The footsteps stopped just behind him, and Thomas could feel eyes assessing him with the kind of professional evaluation he recognized from his own training. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities that hung in the air like morning mist over the castle grounds. Without turning around, Thomas continued his meticulous work, waiting for whatever was about to unfold in this most unexpected of moments. The voice that broke the silence carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. "Guard Mitchell," the stranger said, and Thomas felt his spine straighten involuntarily. The fact that this unknown officer knew his name sent a chill of uncertainty through him. Thomas turned slowly to face the speaker, his training keeping his movements controlled and respectful, despite the surprise racing through his mind. Before him stood a man in his early 40s, wearing a uniform that bore the distinctive insignia of the Special Air Service. The SAS badge seemed to gleam with an almost mythical quality, representing the elite of British military forces. The officer's appearance was exactly what Thomas might have imagined from stories he'd heard about the legendary regiment. Average height but powerfully built, with weathered features that spoke of countless operations in hostile environments around the world. His eyes held a sharpness that seemed to take in every detail of Thomas's appearance and bearing in a matter of seconds. "Sir," Thomas responded, setting down his cleaning cloth and coming to attention. His mind raced with questions about why an SAS officer would be here, why he would know Thomas's name, and what could possibly be happening that would bring such a figure into the peaceful routine of palace duty. The officer's gaze moved past Thomas to survey the corridor and the rooms beyond, his professional assessment taking in sightlines, entry points, and tactical considerations that Thomas was only beginning to understand. There was something in the man's manner that suggested he was preparing for possibilities that went far beyond normal palace security concerns. "You've been noticed," the officer said simply, his words carrying implications that Thomas couldn't fully grasp. "Your instructors at Sandhurst spoke highly of your marksmanship scores and tactical awareness. Your commanders here have mentioned your dedication and attention to detail. The revelation that people had been discussing him, evaluating him without his knowledge, created a mixture of pride and anxiety in Thomas's chest. He had always tried to excel in his duties, but he had never imagined that his performance was being watched by figures from the elite Special Forces community." The SAS officer stepped closer, and Thomas could see the small scars on his hands and face that told stories of operations in dangerous places around the globe. This was a man who had faced real combat, who had made decisions under pressure that most people couldn't even imagine. His presence in the peaceful halls of the castle seemed almost surreal. "What we do," the officer continued, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone while losing none of its intensity, "requires individuals who can maintain their composure under pressure, who can think clearly when everything around them is chaos, and who can be trusted with responsibilities that go far beyond normal military service." Thomas felt his heart rate increase as he began to understand that this conversation was leading somewhere significant. The routine morning of cleaning and maintenance was transforming into something that could change the entire direction of his military career, possibly his entire life. The officer's eyes never left Thomas's face as he spoke, clearly reading every reaction and response with the skill of someone trained to assess human nature under extreme circumstances. It was both intimidating and oddly reassuring to be evaluated by someone of such obvious competence and experience. "The world has become a more dangerous place in recent years," the officer said, his tone taking on a gravity that made Thomas understand this was no casual conversation. "Threats that once seemed distant have moved closer to home. The skills that were once needed only in foreign operations are now required for domestic security as well." The implications of these words settled over Thomas like a heavy cloak. He had enlisted to serve his country, but his vision of that service had been shaped by the ceremonial duties and traditional responsibilities of the Royal Guard. The possibility that he might be called to something more challenging and dangerous had never seriously crossed his mind. Around them, the ancient stone walls of the castle seemed to absorb the weight of their conversation, as if these halls had witnessed countless such moments throughout history when young soldiers were called to step beyond their expected roles into something greater and more perilous. The SAS officer reached into his jacket, and Thomas instinctively straightened, sensing that whatever was about to happen would mark a turning point in his life that he couldn't possibly reverse once it began. The weapon that emerged from the officer's jacket was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen during his palace duties. It was a compact assault rifle, clearly designed for close-quarters combat rather than ceremonial purposes. The matte black finish absorbed the light from the corridor windows, and every component spoke of advanced engineering and lethal efficiency. Thomas's training kicked in automatically as he assessed the weapon. It appeared to be a modified version of the standard military rifle, but with attachments and modifications that suggested specialized tactical applications. The sight of such serious hardware in the peaceful corridors of the castle created a jarring disconnect that made his pulse quicken. "This," the SAS officer said, holding the rifle with the casual familiarity of someone who had carried similar weapons through countless dangerous situations, "is not a ceremonial piece. Every component has been tested in real combat situations around the world. It represents the difference between traditional military service and the reality of modern threats. The weight of the moment pressed down on Thomas as he realized this was far more than a simple demonstration or educational discussion. The officer's manner suggested that he was being offered something significant, possibly life-changing, but also potentially dangerous in ways he was only beginning to understand. The corridor around them seemed to fade into the background as Thomas focused entirely on the weapon and the man holding it. His months of routine palace duty had not prepared him for a moment like this, where the comfortable predictability of his service was being challenged by possibilities he had never seriously considered. Intelligence. Reports suggest that threats to high-value targets have evolved, the officer continued, his voice maintaining that professional tone that somehow made even the most dramatic statements sound matter-of-fact. The techniques that work against conventional military forces are not always effective against the kind of enemies we face today. Thomas found himself studying the officer's face, trying to read the experience written there in lines and scars that told stories of operations in hostile territory around the globe. This was a man who had faced real danger, who had made decisions under pressure that could mean the difference between life and death for himself and others. The rifle seemed to grow heavier in the officer's hands, not physically but symbolically, as if it carried the weight of all the responsibilities and dangers that came with the kind of service he was apparently being offered. Thomas understood that accepting whatever was being proposed would mean leaving behind the relative safety and predictability of his current role. Your marksmanship scores indicate you have natural ability, the officer said, his assessment delivered with the clinical precision of someone accustomed to evaluating human potential under extreme circumstances. But natural ability alone is not enough for what we do. The question is whether you have the mental resilience and adaptability required for operations where the rules are constantly changing. The ancient stones of the castle walls seemed to press closer as Thomas realized that this conversation was rapidly moving beyond the theoretical into something concrete and immediate. The comfortable routine of his morning cleaning duties felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Even though only minutes had passed since this encounter began, the officer's eyes never left Thomas's face as he extended the weapon toward him, the gesture carrying implications that went far beyond a simple transfer of equipment. This was clearly a test of some kind, a moment where Thomas would need to make a decision that could alter the entire trajectory of his military career. "The choice is yours," the officer said, his tone suggesting that there would be no pressure, no judgment regardless of what Thomas decided. "But understand that once you take this weapon, once you commit to what it represents, there will be no going back to the simple certainties of ceremonial duty." Thomas felt his hand moving almost involuntarily toward the offered rifle, his military training responding to the authority and professionalism of the SAS officer, even as his mind struggled to process the full implications of what was happening. The familiar weight of routine and predictability was giving way to something unknown and potentially transformative. The moment stretched between them like a bridge over a chasm, with Thomas's comfortable past on one side and an uncertain, but clearly more dangerous future on the other. The decision he made in the next few seconds would determine which direction his life would take from this point forward. Thomas's fingers closed around the rifle's grip, and immediately he felt the difference between this weapon and the ceremonial arms he was accustomed to handling. The balance was perfect, designed for rapid deployment and accurate fire under stress. Every surface had been engineered for functionality rather than display, and the weapon seemed to communicate its lethal purpose through his fingertips. As he accepted the rifle, Thomas noticed the officer watching his handling technique with the keen attention of a professional evaluator. The way Thomas positioned his hands, how he checked the safety mechanism, and his instinctive assessment of the weapon's condition were all being noted and analyzed by someone with extensive experience in such matters. "Good," the officer said simply, his approval carrying more weight than elaborate praise from a less qualified source. "Your muscle memory from training is solid. Now we need to see how you adapt when the parameters change unexpectedly." Before Thomas could ask what that meant, the SAS officer did something that completely defied every expectation Thomas had about military protocol and hierarchy. The experienced Special Forces veteran, a man who had undoubtedly commanded operations in the world's most dangerous locations, slowly lowered himself to one knee before Thomas. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Thomas understood about military rank and protocol. that he felt momentarily paralyzed by confusion. In his 18 months of service, he had never seen a superior officer take such a position before a subordinate, and certainly not someone of the SAS officer's obvious experience and authority. "Sir," Thomas began, his voice betraying his bewilderment, but the officer raised a hand to silence him while maintaining his kneeling position. The corridor around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the ancient stones themselves were witnessing something unprecedented in their long history. The officer's eyes remained fixed on Thomas's face, studying his reaction to this dramatic reversal of expected roles. There was something in that steady gaze that suggested this wasn't a random gesture but a carefully calculated test designed to assess how Thomas would respond when confronted with a situation that defied his training and expectations. "In the field," the officer said from his kneeling position, his voice carrying the same authority despite the submissive posture, "rank and protocol can become meaningless in a matter of seconds. The person with the clearest tactical vision must take command, regardless of their position on the organizational chart." Thomas felt the rifle growing heavy in his hands as the full implications of this demonstration began to dawn on him. This wasn't just about weapons handling or marksmanship skills. The officer was showing him that the kind of operations he might be called to participate in would require a fundamental shift in thinking about authority, hierarchy, and decision-making under pressure. The weight of responsibility settling on Thomas's shoulders was almost physical, as he realized that the kneeling officer was waiting for him to take command of the situation. Every instinct from his traditional military training screamed against assuming authority over a superior, especially one with such obvious experience and qualifications. Yet the test was clear. The SAS officer remained kneeling, his patient expression indicating that he would maintain this position until Thomas demonstrated his ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances and take charge when the situation demanded it. Regardless of conventional protocol, the ancient corridor became a classroom where centuries of military tradition met the harsh realities of modern conflict. Thomas understood that his response in this moment would determine not just whether he was accepted for whatever the officer was proposing, but how successfully he could transition from ceremonial duties to operational responsibilities. His grandfather's stories of military service had never included moments like this, situations where the established order could be turned upside down in an instant, and where survival might depend on the ability to think beyond conventional boundaries. This was clearly preparation for a world where adaptability mattered more than strict adherence to protocol. The rifle in Thomas's hands seemed to pulse with potential energy, waiting for him to make the mental transition from following orders to giving them, from being a component in a well-ordered system to being a leader capable of making critical decisions under extraordinary circumstances. The officer's patient gaze never wavered as he waited for Thomas to embrace the responsibility being offered to him, to step across the threshold from conventional military service into something far more challenging and unpredictable. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with unspoken challenges and expectations that Thomas was only beginning to comprehend. The SAS officer remained motionless in his kneeling position, his eyes conveying both patience and an unmistakable expectation that Thomas would rise to meet this unprecedented situation. Thomas felt his military training warring with the bizarre reality of the moment. Everything he had learned about respect for superior officers conflicted with the clear message that he was being asked to take command. The rifle in his hand seemed to grow warmer, as if it were responding to the tension building in the corridor. "This is wrong," Thomas finally said, his voice carrying the strain of his internal conflict. "You should be giving me orders, not kneeling before me. This goes against everything I've been taught about military structure and respect for rank." The officer's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of approval Thomas had seen since this strange encounter began. "And yet," the officer replied, his voice maintaining its calm authority despite his submissive posture, "your instinct to question the situation shows exactly the kind of thinking we need. In hostile territory, the person who blindly follows protocol without assessing the tactical situation is the one who gets everyone killed." Thomas realized that his expression of discomfort had actually been the correct response, that the officer was testing his ability to think independently, even when faced with a superior's unexpected behavior. The lesson was becoming clearer. Effective special operations required individuals who could maintain their analytical abilities, even when confronted with situations that defied their previous experience. "Stand up, sir," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger as he began to understand the nature of the test. "If this is about leadership in unconventional situations, then I need to demonstrate that I can make sound decisions regardless of the circumstances, including telling a superior officer when their actions don't serve the mission objectives." The SAS officer rose smoothly to his feet, his movement revealing the athletic conditioning that came from years of demanding physical operations. His face now showed clear satisfaction with Thomas's response, indicating that the young guard had passed this particular evaluation successfully. "Excellent," the officer said, his tone carrying genuine approval. The ability to think clearly under psychological pressure is just as important as physical courage or technical skills. We've seen too many capable soldiers fail in the field because they couldn't adapt their thinking. When faced with unexpected circumstances, Thomas felt a surge of confidence as he realized he had navigated the test successfully, but also a growing awareness of how much he still needed to learn. If this kind of psychological evaluation was just the beginning, what other challenges would he face if he committed to this path? The officer gestured toward the rifle still in Thomas's hands. "That weapon represents more than just firepower," he explained. "It's a symbol of the responsibility we carry every time we deploy on an operation. Every decision you make, every shot you fire, has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation." As Thomas examined the rifle more carefully, he noticed details he had missed in the initial shock of receiving it. There were small modifications that suggested it had been customized for specific operational requirements, and wear patterns that indicated extensive use in challenging environments. This wasn't just demonstration equipment, but a weapon that had seen real action. The weight of that realization settled over him as he understood that he was holding something that had potentially been used to protect lives and complete missions in dangerous locations around the world. The responsibility that came with such tools was far greater than anything he had experienced in his ceremonial duties. "The question now," the officer said, his gaze becoming more intense, "is whether you're prepared to leave behind the predictable world of palace duty and enter a realm where every decision matters, where mistakes can have fatal consequences, and where success often depends on your ability to improvise under pressure." Thomas looked down at the rifle in his hands, then back at the officer whose scarred features told stories of countless operations in hostile territory. The choice before him was becoming clearer, but also more daunting as he began to understand the full implications of what he was being offered. The ancient corridors of the castle seemed to whisper with the voices of previous generations who had faced similar moments of decision, when the comfortable certainties of peacetime service gave way to the harsh realities of operational deployment. Thomas realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just his military career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to serve his country. Thomas stood in the corridor holding the rifle, feeling the weight of more than just the weapon in his hands. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows had shifted position during their conversation, marking the passage of time that had transformed his understanding of his military service and his future possibilities. The SAS officer waited patiently, his experienced eyes reading every nuance of Thomas's internal struggle. There was no pressure in his manner, no attempt to influence the decision through persuasion or manipulation. This was clearly a choice that had to be made freely, with full understanding of the consequences that would follow. "If I accept," Thomas said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of serious consideration, "what happens to my duties here? My commitment to the Royal Guard was supposed to be for several more years. I gave my word when I accepted this position." The officer nodded, showing respect for Thomas's concern about his existing obligations. "Your service here has been exemplary, and that commitment speaks well of your character. However, there are times when national security requirements take precedence over standard military assignments. Your commanders have already been briefed on the possibility of your transfer to special duties." The revelation that discussions about his future had been taking place without his knowledge was both flattering and unsettling. Thomas realized that his performance had been monitored and evaluated by people far above his normal chain of command, that his potential had been assessed by individuals whose judgment could alter the course of his entire military career. As he considered the offer, Thomas thought about his grandfather's stories of military service during a different era, when threats were more clearly defined and the enemy wore recognizable uniforms. The world the SAS officer was describing sounded far more complex and dangerous, where the rules of engagement were constantly evolving and where split-second decisions could have international consequences. The training, Thomas asked, his practical nature asserting itself despite the magnitude of the moment. How long would it take and what would it involve? I need to understand what I'm committing to before I can make an informed decision. The officer's slight smile suggested approval for Thomas's methodical approach to such an important choice. Initial training would be 6 months of the most demanding preparation you can imagine. Physical conditioning beyond anything you've experienced, tactical training in environments designed to test your limits, and psychological preparation for situations where failure means not just personal death, but potential disaster for others. The description was sobering, but Thomas found himself feeling a stirring of excitement rather than fear. The routine of palace duty, while honorable and necessary, had never fully engaged his capabilities or satisfied his desire to make a meaningful contribution to his country's security. Thomas looked down at the rifle again, seeing it now not just as a weapon but as a symbol of the trust that would be placed in him if he accepted this opportunity. The specialized modifications and evidence of field use told a story of missions completed and lives protected by individuals with the skills and courage to operate in the world's most dangerous places. My grandfather always said that a soldier's greatest honor comes from being trusted. With the most important missions, Thomas said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. He served in conventional forces during his era, but I think he would understand that every generation faces different challenges and must be prepared to meet them with whatever tools are necessary. The SAS officer straightened slightly, sensing that Thomas was approaching his decision. The morning light caught the insignia on his uniform, highlighting the symbols that represented some of the most elite military units in the world, organizations where acceptance meant joining a brotherhood of individuals committed to taking on missions that others could not or would not attempt. "Then you'll accept?" the officer asked, his tone remaining neutral despite what Thomas sensed was genuine interest in his response. "You understand that once you begin training, there will be no returning to your previous duties or your previous understanding of military service?" Thomas felt a moment of vertigo as he stood at the threshold between his comfortable past and an uncertain but clearly more challenging future. The castle corridors that had become so familiar over the past 18 months suddenly felt like part of a different lifetime, a peaceful interlude before he stepped into the real work of military service. "Yes," Thomas said, his voice carrying the finality of a decision that would reshape everything he thought he knew about duty, service, and his own capabilities. "I accept." The officer extended his hand, and as Thomas shifted the rifle to accept the handshake, he felt the symbolic weight of leaving behind one phase of his military career and beginning another that would test every aspect of his character, skills, and commitment to protecting others. The ancient stones of the castle seemed to witness this moment with approval, as if they had seen countless such transitions over the centuries, young soldiers stepping forward to meet whatever challenges their era demanded of them.